All right, students, welcome back here to 29.1.2. We're going to continue on with the civil rights movement and some of the actions that are taken by the government and by protesters to try and improve civil rights across the board for those who are fighting to ensure and improve African American rights in the United States. So let's go ahead and just jump right in here. All right, so first off, JFK, John F. Kennedy, he ran on a platform in order to try to strengthen civil rights in the United States. So he goes forth and he's like, yeah, we're going to make some serious changes here. We're going to pass laws. We're going to enact legislation. We're going to really start to change things and make sure that what's happened in the 1950s does not continue into the 1960s. However, he runs into major roadblocks in the form of Southern congressmen and Southern senators who are not willing to take an inch and give any additional rights to African Americans in the South. And this is not just a Southern congressional issue. This is also along the issue with Southern governors too, who are strong advocates of discrimination practices and segregation. So there's a big political front that Kennedy's trying to push back against. And even if he can get any traction in Congress, the senators in the Senate have basically said, if you bring anything that is civil rights legislation, we will filibuster or sit there on the floor and talk until somebody withdraws the bill. So they were putting up these major stumbling blocks for Kennedy and prevented him from really enacting any real legislative help for African Americans. One thing, though, that does change is that once Kennedy is assassinated, Lyndon Johnson takes over. And Lyndon Johnson's from Texas. And so Lyndon Johnson has a lot of political pull with Southern senators and congressmen, and he uses it very effectively to start to push through legislation that actually makes a difference. The very first thing is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, I look at this from a constitutional perspective and a legal issue. I've studied law a little bit when I was in college, and while I'm still in college, but while I was studying it there, I spent a lot of time studying legal reviews and how to write. And anyways, I've studied the law a little bit. But one of the big things is the 14th Amendment, in all reality, could have been used to enforce all of these rules already that were included in the Civil Rights Act. Now, why do you need the Civil Rights Act then of 1964? Well, if you guys remember, way back into your constitutional classes where we talk about law and we talk about judicial precedents, there had already been a number of precedents that created issues in order to have the 14th Amendment reinterpreted or properly interpreted. And the Civil Rights Act puts teeth to the law, and it really helps out too. Because once again, you put teeth onto a law and you have an enforcement mechanism, that's how real change can start to happen when you're facing a staunch opposition like you were looking at in many of the southern states and governments. So what does it do? Well, it's designed to give equal rights and access and accommodations for all people in all public spaces. Remember, public spaces. Your private home is not a public space. Your private country club is not a public space. When we talk about public spaces, that means somewhere that is open, that is supposed to cater to the entire population. If you have a open environment, like say, for example, a restaurant, and you're open to the public, you're not allowed to discriminate against who comes in there and uses and purchases products from there. Now, again, do you have the right to refuse service? Yes, you do, but at the same time, if you can't make a legally justified reason and somebody decides to sue you over it, and it turns out that you are breaking the Civil Rights Act, you could find yourself in a world of hurt. Next up, it desegregates all the schools officially. So this is, look across the United States, desegregation is happening no matter what. It creates the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. This ensures equality in the workforce. It's still around today. It's designed to make sure that people are paid fairly for their work. so that people are not discriminated against, and so you don't have two accountants sitting in the same office, and one of them's a white man and one of them's a black man, and they both have college degrees and they both worked at the company for 5 years. You can't pay the white man $25,000 more a year than the black man without reasonable justification behind it. And if you're looking at a $25,000 difference, you probably don't have a reasonable justification for that. So the Equal Opportunity Commission really enforces balance in the workforce. That's what it's in the workplace. That's what it's designed to do. And the other thing, remember when I talk about teeth, it gives the Attorney General more power to enforce laws that create violations against the Civil Rights Act. So when it's federal, remember, federal law trumps state law. Again, going into brief legal arguments here. So if somebody is found violating the Civil Rights Act in, say, Alabama, where a lot of these problems are happening, the state possibly could, or the person could sue the person in a state court, but are you going to get a fair trial in a state court with discriminatory policies in place? Probably not. But if you bring a federal case over, it trumps the state law, and now the federal government is involved, and it goes into a federal case, which is a lot different. So it really puts some bite behind the executive branch to be able to make things equal for African Americans. All right. Also, it establishes something called affirmative action. Now, I will start by saying affirmative action, even today, is somewhat controversial. But there is a reason that it was enacted at first, okay? We're not going to discuss the controversial aspects of affirmative action. That is up for you to, remember when I always talk about shaping your own worldview? It is up for you to research, look over, and make your own determination as to how affirmative action works in the workplace, and if it's a positive or a negative. That is entirely up for you to research and look at. And I would talk to your parents about it too, if you're really interested, because I'm sure they all have views, and your worldview is shaped by your parents. So talk with your parents sometimes. Anyways, affirmative action, it really starts with federal contractors. So the federal government, since they're the ones pulling the purse strings, they were able to say to contractors, you need to have X number of African American workers in your workforce, or a percentage. Usually it's a percentage is what they go off of. So you may need to have 20% of your workforce be African American to start to integrate businesses so they can't discriminate. That forces them to hire a certain number. It soon got expanded into major businesses and local governments. It still exists a lot of times in government positions and jobs. And it's really designed, when it's established, to allow them a doorway into jobs that they have historically been prohibited and kept out of. So it now gives them a chance for financial and economic mobility in society. And that's one of the true aspects that why affirmative action is initially put forward, to ensure that, you know, the African American community does get access and help in getting some jobs in there. Also, equal pay is still still part of this too. So not only do you have to put in a certain percentage of minority workers, you also have to pay them a fair wage comparative to their peers. Also, this is still in place even in higher education. So like in colleges and universities, they have to meet a certain percentage of minority students allowed into their schools too. Because even universities were discriminatory during the time frame where they would prohibit African Americans from attending their schools. Again, higher education more often than not gives you social mobility and gives you economic power. If you cannot access it, then you are going to suffer economically. You're not going to be able to pull yourself out from a poor position if you don't have the access to resources. All right. So, again, I talked to you that there is still controversy around it. If you're really interested, go make your own decision, do your own research, talk to your parents. All right, let's talk about school busing. This is an idea. When we're still looking at schools, they tend to still be pretty segregated, and it's from a number of factors. More often than not, what you start to see in the 1950s and the 1960s is a term that if you study, how do I want to put it? There's historians that do study this, and they put a term on it, and the term is white flight. And again, this is look at your own worldview, do your own research, study, and see if you think that white flight occurred. But the belief system is that white people purposely pulled out of the inner city and moved to the suburbs to try to escape from African Americans and minority groups. In a lot of realities, what you look at when you're talking about this is that you had higher income brackets and people started to move to the suburbs because they could buy and build their own homes, and they had access to automobiles so that they could commute into work. Again, there's a lot of complicated aspects to the study of migration of white workers out of the inner city or even the outer edges of the city. Fascinating research, fascinating thing to study. If you're ever interested, you might even look into it when you're studying human geography later on in your schoolwork. So kind of interesting to do. Anyways, back to the point. Because of this movement of population from the inner city to the suburbs, you now just had segregation solely based upon African Americans were centered in one part of the city. White Americans had moved out into the suburbs and were centered in another part of the city. Problem is that you're not going to get equal education funding because of that. And people saw this as still an equality issue, so they started a program called busing, which is where you would have African American students who would be bused from their part of town to white schools, and then you'd have white students that would be bused into the inner city into African American schools. So you started to see this dual role of attempt of segregation of the desegregation of the schools. Tried to introduce both groups into the respective schools themselves. And this was based off of a Supreme Court decision to racially balance the schools themselves. Now, was it popular? In the white community, there was a lot of pushback against it. There's conversations, and again, this is a lot of social research and study that you would have to look at to understand it. For the most part, most people don't believe that busing was very effective. At the same time, there are definitely proponents who say that it was effective. In fact, there's advocates out there who state that we should return to try to do school busing in order to balance out funding for public education. So there's ideas and concepts still existing around the idea of school busing. This is why you guys learn this stuff, because these arguments are still happening. Voting rights are expanded too. One of the issues that you still saw in the South is that you have poll taxes, literacy tests. They had to take citizenship tests. I think I read in one area there was a citizenship that was about 20 pages long that was given only to African Americans to try to pass, and it was darn near impossible to pass unless you had an advanced law degree. And so in order to try to push back against this, the SNCC and CORE went down and tried to register 900,000 voters. And when they got down there, of course, they were attacked, they were beaten, they were harassed, they were violence was inflicted upon them, often scaring them out of the locations where they were at. It got so bad that eventually 3 of the volunteers were killed and murdered. And the thing is that a group of men were arrested, and the idea, remember when we talked about the Attorney General now having teeth? If it would have gone to a court case in the South, there's a really good chance, and I know this sounds disgusting, we all learn about our legal system, how it's supposed to be equal and fair, but there was a good chance that these guys would have gotten off from the murder, that they would not have been convicted. And that's where the federal government stepped in and used the power of the Civil Rights Act to actually try and convict these people of murder, which they, like I said, they would have probably gotten away with it. So this shows you the examples of why it was needed, why the Civil Rights Act was important. You also have the famous Selma March. What happens is again, you go down there and you're trying to get them registered to vote. And you have 51% of the population in Selma, Alabama, and only 1% of them could vote. And remember when I talked about those impossible tests? Well, they had 400 African American voters who went to try to take the test, and every single one of them were told that they had failed the test. Now, again, you can't independently verify these tests either. Basically, you would take the test, it would go to one of the voter registers, and they would look over it, and they would make the determination if you'd passed it or not. So if you think that it was a fair and just system, even if you could pass the literacy test, more often than not, you were set up for failure even before you stepped in the door. That's why it was unfair. And so a group of protesters show up and still try to fight to get them the right to be able to vote. Again, what happens is violence does follow, and one of the volunteers are murdered. And with that, Martin Luther King and his followers start on this large, long march from Selma, Alabama, all the way to the capital, Montgomery, Alabama, to protest the death of this man and also protest the lack of access to voting rights. What happens when they get to Montgomery? Well, again, just like if you remember before, they're attacked by the police again. Attack dogs are let loose on them, and eventually it requires federal marshals to intervene and come and end the violence. Selma is a very important march in the era of African American rights, and recently, within my lifetime, they reached an anniversary milestone, and they recreated portions of the march, and they actually had them broadcast on there. And you still had a number of the people who had organized the march show up and march also. All right, so last thing that happens, LBJ, he goes to correct this injustice of voting issues. So the Civil Rights Act here bans literacy tests. Also, the U.S. government would send what they're called election monitors, meaning that they would have an independent group go down to register people to vote, ensure that they got their registration and that they were actually allowed to vote. Ban poll taxes, and you really saw at the end of the 1960s, you see an equality arise in voter registration where both white and African American voters registered voters make up about 60% of the respective populations. So you start to see African Americans start to gain political power in the South to truly try to make a change to benefit them and their position in society. All right, this ends this part of our discussion on civil rights. We will continue on with it tomorrow. Now, also, I need you not only just to do the quiz that is assigned with us daily, but there is also a corrections retake policy quiz that I need you to review over and answer, and make sure you understand that policy, because I did state it at the beginning when we started going to online schooling, and I'm still getting about 5 to 7 emails a day asking about it, so I thought I would clarify it for you guys. All right, thanks again, guys. See you tomorrow.